Tensions between Seoul and Tokyo continue to sour over the radar missile lock-on and flyby incidents. South Korean officials are in Japan to meet with their counterparts, and speculation is that they could be joined by US officials as well to act as a mediator. We'll look further at the situation later in the show. But first, we have the latest headlines with Devin Whiting at the News Center. Devin?
Hi, Jang-ho. Korean automaker Hyundai Motor has reached an agreement with the city of Gwangju in the country's southwest to set up a joint venture with the city and build a car factory which has the potential to create jobs for people in the region. For more, we have our business correspondent Kim Hae-sung joining us on the line. Hae-sung, what do you have for us?
Devin, the agreement ceremony between Gwangju City government and Hyundai Motor took place in Gwangju at 2:30 p.m. Around 400 people, including President Moon Jae-in, government officials, representatives from Hyundai Motor, and local residents attended the ceremony. As the top two shareholders of the $631 million project, the city government will invest $53 million and Hyundai Motor $48 million. Hyundai Motor will build mini SUVs from its new plant in Gwangju starting from 2021 with an annual production capacity of 100,000 cars. Plant employees will work 44 hours a week and receive an annual salary of 35 million Korean won, or around $31,000, less than half the average annual wages earned by the Hyundai Motor's unionized workers. The central and city government will provide welfare benefits like public housing and health care. According to the compromise made with the labor union, collective wage bargaining will take place only after the cumulative output of the new factory reaches 350,000 cars. But a provision was added which states that the details of the future wage negotiation can be discussed between the management and the union if a significant event takes place.
Well, Hae-sung, this is an ambitious project, fairly unusual too, you might say. And for Gwangju, it could help a lot of people.
Yeah, that's right. The deal is groundbreaking in a number of ways, as it's a public-private joint venture aimed at creating jobs at home to help the struggling manufacturing sector and to stem falling facility investment, with the Gwangju City government and Hyundai Motor being the top two shareholders. It's also the first time that Hyundai Motor is building a factory here in Korea in more than 2 decades, as it has relocated its manufacturing operations to countries like China, citing high labor costs at home. For Gwangju City, the plant will help create around 10,000 new jobs. Gwangju has a population of around 1.5 million, but it saw over 8,000 residents leave the city in 2017, two-thirds of whom were in their 20s and 30s. So overall, the deal is expected to create more jobs, boost the local economy, while more details over how to increase demand to export those vehicles will have to be fleshed out. Back to you, Devin.
All right, Hae-sung, very interesting. Thanks for that. Now, last year was a good one for Samsung Electronics. Its sales hit an all-time high for the year, but they were sharply lower in the fourth quarter. Sales, the company says, will likely continue to decline this year. Kim Ji-yeon explains.
Korean tech giant Samsung Electronics says its sales and operating profits both hit a yearly all-time high in 2018 due to a semiconductor boom that lasted until the third quarter last year, but forecasts weaker earnings for this year on slowing chip demand. On Thursday, the company says its combined sales for 2018 amounted to $219.3 billion, some $2 billion more than its preliminary estimate released earlier in January. Operating profits for 2018 amounted to nearly $53 billion, which is $0.6 billion less than its earlier estimate, but is still a record high. Its operating profits in the fourth quarter of last year were similar to the preliminary estimate of $9.7 billion, which is a 28.7% drop from the previous year. Sales during the October to December period last year were slightly up from the previous estimate at $53.3 billion, a 10.2% drop on year. Samsung said the disappointing Q4 earnings are mainly due to global chip makers adjusting their inventories and its main clients cutting their orders. The company says it expected overall annual earnings to decline this year, although sales of memory products and OLED panels is expected to pick up in the second half. Its memory and processor chips account for more than 70% of overall profit. The general consensus among local market watchers backs up Samsung's projections that it may be able to rebound in the latter half of the year thanks to seasonal factors. But analysts also say a dramatic uptick in the company's earnings is unlikely since semiconductor prices are expected to drop further this year in response to growing signs of a slowdown in the global economy and rising uncertainties in trade. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
The U.S. Federal Reserve is signaling an end to its series of interest rate hikes. In its policy meeting Wednesday, it said it'll be patient in considering future adjustments. Kim Yo-sun reports.
The Federal Reserve has held its target interest rate steady at 2.25 to 2.5%. Following its Federal Open Market Committee meeting on Wednesday, it also reiterated that it will be patient as the Fed evaluates future rate hikes.
In this environment, we believe we can best support the economy by being patient in evaluating the outlook before making any future adjustment to policy.
The statement released by the rate-setting body also said the Fed would continue to rely on data for future decisions, adding that the U.S. economy remains on solid footing.
The U.S. economy is in a good place, and we will continue to use our monetary policy tools to help keep it there. The jobs picture continues to be strong, with the unemployment rate near historic lows and with stronger wage gains.
This is in contrast with the Fed's last statement in mid-December, in which it said some further gradual rate increases would be warranted. Economists also forecast the Fed would freeze rates in January, according to CNBC, which surveyed more than 50 market watchers. Since 2015, when the Fed announced an end to its zero interest rate policy, it has raised rates 9 times and hiked them 4 times last year alone. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
President Trump apparently disagrees with his top intelligence chiefs who say North Korea probably won't give up its nuclear weapons. He tweeted Wednesday that there's a decent chance that it will, and he said he looks forward to seeing Kim Jong-un again. Lee Seung-jae reports.
President Trump is projecting optimism about his ability to get North Korea to denuclearize, despite recent remarks by one of his top intel chiefs, Dan Coats, who told senators this week that Pyongyang is unlikely to fully give up its nuclear weapons program. In a flurry of tweets on Wednesday, Trump said Washington's relationship with North Korea is the best it has ever been, and there is, quote, a decent chance the North will abandon its nuclear weapons. However, this week's comments by the Director of National Intelligence aren't the first from a senior Trump administration official to suggest the North isn't serious about denuclearization. In a report released Wednesday, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, citing commercial satellite imagery from January 20th, also said there has been no new dismantling activity at the missile facility in North Korea's Dongchangni since August. After their summit in Singapore last June, Kim Jong-un committed to permanently shut down the missile engine test site and launch pad under the observation of international experts. Along with his optimism over North Korea's eventual denuclearization, President Trump also patted himself on the back for his other successes with North Korea. He hailed the North's lack of nuclear and missile tests, the return of remains of some American troops killed during the Korean War, and the safe release of American hostages. Calling it a whole different story compared to the previous Obama administration, President Trump said he looks forward to seeing the North Korean leader at their next summit. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Senior officials from the two Koreas are meeting today at the joint liaison office in the North Korean border town of Kaesong to discuss their project to modernize and connect their roads. South Korea sent 3 officials from the Ministries of Unification and Land, and the North sent 3 from its Environment Ministry. Seoul says the delegations will exchange road-related technical data. It's also possible that they'll schedule more inspections of roads in the eastern part of North Korea. Seoul and Pyongyang inspected North Korea's eastern roads last year, but without any equipment. Today's meeting might result in a schedule for more inspections now that the UN Security Council has waived its sanctions to allow equipment to be brought in for that purpose. I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines.
Tensions have been rising between South Korea and Japan over the past several weeks for multiple disputed encounters between their militaries. And with those unresolved, South Korean foreign ministry officials visited Japan on Wednesday to meet with their Japanese counterparts and possibly with officials from the US military as well. Choi Seong has this report.
Seoul's Foreign Ministry says Kim Tae-jin, the Director General of the ministry's North American Affairs Bureau, traveled to Japan on Wednesday for a two-day trip, accompanied by other ministry officials.
Kim Tae-jin will visit UN flag bases in Japan from January 30th to the 31st after receiving an invitation from the UN. He's expected to meet with officials from US Forces Japan.
The visit is aimed at providing Kim and his delegation a chance to meet with their Japanese counterparts, as the two countries have been embroiled in a radar dispute involving a Japanese maritime patrol jet and a South Korean naval destroyer in December. Watchers say it's possible Washington will play a mediating role between its regional allies to resolve the standoff, as there could be a trilateral session joined by a representative from the U.S. Forces Japan. This comes as the U.S. ambassador to South Korea, Harry Harris, had a series of meetings with South Korea's defense and foreign ministers in Seoul on Monday, in which they cover recent issues. Japan's Defense Minister Takeshi Iwaya, speaking to Japanese broadcaster NHK on Tuesday, called for a need to cool tensions, adding that a meeting with his South Korean counterpart could happen soon. Seoul-Tokyo relations have deteriorated to levels not seen in years over the radar dispute. It has been compounded by the ongoing tensions over Japan's wartime atrocities against Korea, especially Tokyo's use of forced labor and its military sexual enslavement of Korean women during World War II. Choi Seong, Arirang News.
Now today we have joining us Professor Park Won-gon of the Handong Global University. It's good to have you on the show with us today.
Thank you for having me here.
Now I think we should start for our viewers by explaining what this current dispute is and why it has dragged on for so long. So late last year, Tokyo accused a South Korean warship of locking its missile radar onto a Japanese patrol aircraft, and Tokyo demanded an explanation. Seoul denied it had happened and in fact retorted that it couldn't understand why the plane was flying at such a low altitude in an aggressive flight pattern in the first place, especially as the warship was just carrying out a humanitarian act to save a North Korean boat. So why has it escalated so much over the last month or so?
I think it's rather a very simple issue, and it can be easily found out which side make a mistake. As you said, that our government, the warship, and locked this fire control radar to this Japanese patrol airplane, but our government totally deny of this kind of activity. On the other hand, Japanese government insists that they haven't had the very low altitude flyby to this one of the Korean vessels. So this is rather, as I said, simple issue whether this is right or wrong. So actually, the South Korea and Japanese government officials, they met Singapore last year, and they have a working level dialogue to talk about this issue. But if I remember correctly, just one or two rounds of this talk, and then Japanese government totally refused to have another round of talk. So, and then the Japanese government bring this issue on the media, and then the politicians and bureaucrats said that Japan hasn't done nothing wrong, and all these responsibilities is coming from this Korean government. So, and then we have like a tit for tat. So, very few days ago, the Korean Ministry of National Defense, and he wear the pilot's jacket, and also the Japanese defense minister doing same thing. So we have to stop that. So that's the important point.
Let me break it down a little bit further. I mean, why do Tokyo care? Why is it important for the military that South Korea might have locked on this radar in the first place? What does that really show? What does that mean?
Well, there is several kind of speculation. We don't know the exact intention that Japanese government has. But at this moment, we can think about this. The Prime Minister Abe Shinzo's the very important policy. He wanted to make Japan as the normal state because of Japanese so-called peace. The constitution, Japanese Japanese government and Japan itself could not have military forces. Rather, they have self-defense forces. So Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, he really wanted to revise this so-called peace constitution and to have military forces. So for that purpose, it is important to raise some kind of tension near the Korean Peninsula. But well, we can easily think about that. We have I think we are facing the North Korea's nuclear threat. But beginning with this last year, we are actually entering the process of this denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, although it's a very slow step. But so for that purpose, in those kind of situations, Japan wanted to raise tension with South Korea.
Some were expecting Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to address this issue directly in his policy speech to open Parliament earlier this week, but he seemed to avoid mentioning South Korea altogether. But he has come out in a media interview and said that he expects the discussions over this issue to be made in a technical manner, as its defense ministry has repeatedly done so. What does he mean by this, and what do you think he's trying to get out of this?
Well, first of all, important thing is that in his foreign policy speech, yes, you are right, he didn't mention about Korea at all. He got the prime ministership back in year 2012 and year 2013. He clearly mentioned in the same speech, the early year speech, that Korea is one of the most important neighboring country for Japan. And after that time, since this year, he mentioned about the South Korea, and South Korea is the important country, and South Korea, Japan should have a more bright future, and those kind of very positive statement that he had made. But this time, he intentionally omit the South Korea. And then, as you mentioned, right after he made some statement, still. But problem is, I haven't heard about any kind of sign from the Japanese government to resume this working level talk. As I told you, the working level talk is very important. We have several rounds of working level talk, and we can find out who's responsibility of all these kind of incidents, and then we can have some guarantee that not repeat this kind of a military incident between these two countries.
Before we move on to those talks, let me try and get a bit more into the mind of Shinzo Abe as well, because there's much interpretation of why the Abe administration is taking such a hardline stance, as you've mentioned a little bit about the military that they want to renovate and renew. But there's also the argument that this issue plays well with his hardline conservatives back in the domestic side, back in Japan. And also because he has in his mind these next two elections that are coming up, one in April, the local elections, and one in July for the upper house elections. Do you think that's a fair interpretation?
Yes, I think so, because especially the July election is very important. In order to revise this constitution, Japan Prime Minister Abe Shinzo at least have 2/3 of seats in their diet, that's their parliament. So in order to get 2/3 of seats, and he have to raise this kind of tension and to bring his supporters. Starting with this kind of military spat with South Korea, his approval rate is a little bit increased. It's true that, it's a very long history, both actually South Korean politician and also Japanese politician using this kind of a very long-term animosity between these two countries in order to improve their approval rate. So it's a very effective way to gather the support from among the supporters. So I pretty much assume that Prime Minister Abe Shinzo is doing exactly the same thing that many politicians have been doing before.
The timing of this dispute comes while some other sensitive South Korea-Japan relation issues are on the forefront as well. Do you think the timing of this radar dispute has gotten bigger because of some of these other issues that are taking place between the two countries right now as well?
Yes, I think so. And we all know that our South Korean's Supreme Court made a final decision to compensate this wartime forced labor by the Japanese companies, but Japanese government totally refused and deny and criticize those decisions, and they are saying that in 1965, when the South Korea and Japan has a basic agreement, and all this responsibility of the Japanese is, reserved by the basic agreement, so they could not accept this kind of decision. That's the very sensitive issue, because Japan is not only forced to bring the Korean labor forces, but all other countries in the East Asia. So if they start to get compensated by Japanese companies, I don't think they can, they compensate all these tremendous number of forced labor force during the wartime. So that's one of the very important background that Japanese government has such a strong position against South Korea.
But because of these issues, they antagonize the conservatives back in Japan, and therefore Japan, perhaps, and the Tokyo, as Abe's administration feels, they need to take more of this hardline stance. Let's go back to the report we started off with. So South Korean officials have gone to Japan, to the UN-flagged bases, and they're expected to meet with Japanese officials and possibly even meet with US officials to mediate. Do you think these meetings will happen, and do you think it can lead to anything productive?
Well, I think there is a very high possibility to have a so-called trilateral talk among South Korea, Japan, and United States. And you said that, as you mentioned, that the foreign affairs officials, and he's in charge of North American affairs, and he has been invited by United Nations Command, and which is located and actually he is visiting real bases of UNC. So he has a chance to meet his counterpart, Japanese counterpart, and also the Americans. So very good. I think there's a very good opportunity to talk about this issue, especially the military issue about the radar and also the flybys.
Do you think the US wants to get involved in this issue right now, though?
Yes, definitely. But this is a very sensitive issue. You see, South Korea and Japan, we have such a long history of this difficulties. So United States, of course, their main purpose is to have a very close cooperation among three countries. That's their very important national interest for a very long period of time. So if there is this kind of difficulties between Japan and South Korea, United States always try to bring these two countries together and to play a mediate role. I remember that in year 2014, and when the President Barack Obama, and he was trying to bring this our president, then President, the Park Geun-hye, and also the Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo together, because I don't know whether you remember that or not, but during this the Park Geun-hye, the administrative government period, also we had a very difficult kind of relationship with Japan, and Park Geun-hye refused to meet Abe Shinzo for 22 months. So after that time, the President Obama is doing kind of a very successful mediate rule. So after that first meeting, and finally we reached agreement in 2015 about the most sensitive issue, this wartime sex slave issue.
But that was President Obama, who was very involved in it. President Trump is very much America first, hands off. So would he want to get involved? I don't see Trump being the mediator as such in this situation.
Yeah, me neither, because President Trump is a very different, unconventional president, and he doesn't have any intention to bring these kind of things. Rather, he probably can take advantage about, it's going too far. But basically, it is United States' interest to have a very close cooperation among these three countries in order to make North Korea denuclearize, and also to make a balance against the rising Chinese military power.
So we'll have to see how much the US does get involved in this. But if we go back to what we can do in South Korea, what does the South Korean government, how do they need to play out this thing now? Because as you said, Japan don't really want to seem to engage yet.
But South Korea, our government is more actively trying to engage with Japan. Especially, we have a so-called shuttle diplomacy between our South Korean president and the Japanese prime minister. So it is important to resume this shuttle diplomacy and to talk about this highest level. As I told you, it's not that difficult to resolve this military spat, but more serious problem and sensitive problem issue is the wartime sex slave issue and wartime forced labor issue. It will take time. There is such a huge difference between the two countries. But the important thing is that we have to talk, we have to dialogue. Anyway, Japan and South Korea, we are two the liberal democratic country, and the diplomacy is very important.
Well, we're out of time, so we're going to have to end it there. Thank you for coming into the show today and sharing us your thoughts.
All right, thank you.
And that's where we'll wrap up our show. I'll be back same time tomorrow. And in the meantime, do stay tuned to Arirang for our later newscasts for the latest updates from Korea and around the world. Thank you for watching, and goodbye for now.